The wrench slipped from my greasy fingers and clanged against the concrete garage floor at exactly 11:47 p.m., right when I heard Elena's car pull into our driveway. I'd been under the hood of my beat-up Ford for 3 hours, trying to fix a radiator leak that had been bleeding coolant like a stuck pig for weeks. The irony wasn't lost on me. Everything in my life seemed to be leaking lately. I wiped my hands on an old rag and listened as her heels clicked across the pavement. Elena always wore heels, even to grab milk from the corner store. Said it made her feel powerful and in control. These days I figured she needed all the power she could get, considering her tech startup was hemorrhaging money faster than my radiator was losing fluid. The front door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the windows. Then came the phone call. "Yes, he suspects nothing." Elena's voice drifted through the thin walls of our 1960s ranch house. Her tone was different, softer, almost intimate. Not the clipped, business-like voice she'd been using with me for the past 6 months. "It's all going to plan." I froze, wrench halfway to the toolbox. In 22 years of marriage, Elena had never been one for late-night phone conversations. Hell, she barely talked to me during daylight hours anymore. But here she was, whispering sweet nothings to someone at midnight while I was out here playing mechanic to a truck that was probably worth less than her monthly shoe budget. "I know it's complicated," she continued, her voice dropping even lower. "But Ben won't be a problem much longer. Trust me." Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Ben. That's me. Benjamin Carter, 43 years old, home inspector by trade, apparently a problem by marriage. I'd always prided myself on being a pretty good listener. Occupational hazard when you spend your days crawling through other people's houses, checking for termites and foundation cracks. But this was the first time I'd heard my own wife discussing me like I was some kind of pest that needed exterminating. I crept closer to the house, my work boots silent on the dew-wet grass. The living room window was cracked open about 2 inches, Elena's concession to fresh air in a house she claimed always smelled like sawdust and disappointment. "No, he's completely clueless," she was saying now, and I could picture her pacing back and forth across our hardwood floors, the same floors I'd refinished myself 3 summers ago while she was at some conference in Denver. "He thinks I'm just working late. You should see him out there, playing with his little tools. It's almost pathetic." Almost pathetic. Well, that stung a bit. I glanced down at my oil-stained coveralls and calloused hands. Maybe I wasn't pulling down 6 figures like Elena and her tech crowd, but I'd built a decent business inspecting homes for folks who couldn't afford to buy a money pit. There was honor in honest work, or so my old man had always told me. Course, he'd died broke and bitter, so maybe his advice wasn't worth the paper it should have been written on. "I miss you too," Elena whispered, and something cold settled in my stomach like a chunk of undigested meat. "Tomorrow night? Same place?" "Good. I'll tell Ben I have another client dinner." The call ended, and I heard her footsteps heading toward the bedroom. I stayed crouched by the window for another 10 minutes, listening to the sounds of my wife getting ready for bed, the same routine she'd followed for over 2 decades. But somehow it all sounded different now. Foreign. Like I was eavesdropping on a stranger's life. When I finally made it inside, Elena was already under the covers, her back turned to my side of the bed. She didn't stir when I brushed my teeth or when I slipped between the sheets that suddenly felt as welcoming as a morgue slab. "How was your evening?" I asked quietly, testing the waters. "Fine," she mumbled into her pillow. "Client dinner ran late." You know how it is. Actually, I didn't know how it was. My client dinners usually involved coffee and donuts at the kitchen table while I explained why their dream house was actually a nightmare waiting to happen. But Elena's world was all wine tastings and networking events, the kind of sophisticated business entertainment that apparently required lying to your husband about who you were entertaining. I stared at the ceiling for hours, listening to Elena's steady breathing and wondering how long this had been going on. The late nights had started about 4 months ago, right around the time her startup landed some big contract with a medical device company. She'd been working with a new partner, some hotshot CEO named Brennan, who'd moved to town from Chicago with enough venture capital to make everyone in our little corner of Ohio feel like small-town rubes. Brennan. I'd met him exactly once, at Elena's company Christmas party. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of confident smile that probably cost more in dental work than I made in 6 months. He'd shaken my hand with the grip of a man who'd never done manual labor in his life, all soft palms and manicured nails. Elena had practically glowed when she introduced us, like she was presenting a prize poodle at a dog show. "Ben's a home inspector," she'd said, and I swear I heard quotation marks around my job title. "He's very thorough." Miles had nodded politely and made some comment about the importance of attention to detail in all professions, but his eyes had already moved on to more interesting prey. I'd spent the rest of that party nursing a beer in the corner, watching my wife work the room like she was running for mayor of Silicon Valley. Now, lying in the dark next to a woman who was apparently planning my obsolescence, I wondered if Brennan was the voice on the other end of that phone call. It would make sense. He had the kind of smooth confidence that probably made women forget they had husbands waiting at home with greasy hands and honest hearts. The digital clock on Elena's nightstand flipped to 2:33 a.m., and I was still wide awake, my mind churning like a broken garbage disposal. 22 years of marriage, and it had come to this, lying next to my wife like a stranger, wondering if everything I thought I knew about my life was just another lie in a house built on quicksand. But here's the thing about being a home inspector. You learn to spot the warning signs before the whole structure comes tumbling down. Cracks in the foundation, water damage behind the walls, termites eating away at the support beams. I'd seen it all, and I knew how to document everything before the collapse. Elena might think I was clueless, but she was about to learn that underestimating Ben Carter was the first mistake in what was going to be a very expensive education. I rolled over and closed my eyes, already planning my next move. Tomorrow I'd start doing what I did best, inspecting the hidden damage and preparing a very detailed report. The next morning started like any other Tuesday in suburban purgatory. Elena was already gone by the time I dragged myself out of bed at 6:30. Leaving behind only the lingering scent of her expensive perfume and a coffee mug in the sink with lipstick traces around the rim. The same shade of red she'd been wearing to all those client dinners lately. I had 3 home inspections scheduled that day, which meant crawling through basements and attics in houses that other people were stupid enough to think might become their dream homes. But first, I had some investigating of my own to do. Elena's home office was technically off-limits. She'd made that clear about a year ago when her company started handling sensitive client information. But she'd also made it clear that she thought I was too technologically challenged to be a threat to her precious files. Another expensive mistake in her growing collection. Her laptop was password protected naturally, but Elena had always been predictable. After 3 tries, I cracked it. Success 2024. With an exclamation point because she was nothing if not optimistic about her own achievements. The irony of using her password to uncover her betrayal wasn't lost on me. Her email was a goldmine of corporate buzzwords and meaningless jargon, but buried between the synergistic opportunities and paradigm shifts were some interesting threads with Brennan. Nothing explicitly romantic. Elena was too smart for that. But the tone was definitely warmer than standard business correspondence. "Looking forward to our working dinner tonight, Elena? I've reserved our usual table. -M double quote, double quote. Thanks for staying late to review the Peterson contract. Your dedication doesn't go unnoticed. M. The Denver conference was productive, but I missed our daily strategy sessions. -M, our usual table. Daily strategy sessions. I was starting to get a clearer picture of Elena's work schedule, and it looked a lot like a dating schedule with a side of corporate merger. But the real smoking gun was buried in her deleted items folder, because Elena, for all her tech savvy, apparently didn't know that deleting emails doesn't actually make them disappear. It was a thread from 2 weeks ago that made my pressure spike like a faulty boiler. Ben's been asking questions about my schedule. Nothing serious, but we should be more careful. Maybe it's time to accelerate our timeline. The sooner we can move forward with the partnership, the sooner you'll be free to make your own choices. I know. It's just complicated. He's not a bad man, just limited. He wouldn't understand what we're building together. You deserve someone who appreciates your vision, Elena. Someone who can match your ambition. Limited. That word hit me like a punch to the gut from a heavyweight boxer. 22 years of marriage, and my wife thought I was limited. I'd put her through business school while working 2 jobs. I'd supported her through 3 failed startups before this one showed any promise. I'd been her cheerleader, her sounding board, her steady foundation, while she chased her dreams of corporate glory. And I was limited. I printed out the entire email thread and tucked it into my work folder, right next to my inspection reports for the day. Evidence, carefully documented. If Elena wanted to play games, she was about to learn that I'd been in the game a lot longer than she realized. My first inspection was a Victorian house on Maple Street that looked charming from the outside, but was probably rotting from the inside, kind of like my marriage now that I thought about it. The buyers were a young couple, maybe late 20s, still holding hands and talking about their future together, while I crawled through their potential money pit looking for deal breakers. The foundation looks solid, I told them as I emerged from the basement, brushing cobwebs off my coveralls. But you've got some water damage in the northeast corner that's going to need attention. Nothing catastrophic, but it'll get worse if you ignore it. The husband, a kid named Tommy who probably made more in a month than I made in 3, waved off my concerns. We can handle a little water damage. This place has such great bones. Great bones. That's what Elena used to say about our marriage. Great bones, solid foundation, built to last. Funny how things that look solid from the outside can be completely hollow once you start poking around in the dark corners. I finished up the inspection and headed to my truck, already planning my next move. Elena's client dinner was tonight, which meant I had a perfect opportunity to do a little surveillance work. Not stalking, investigating. There's a difference. And any good home inspector knows that you can't fix a problem until you understand exactly how bad the damage really is. The rest of the day dragged by like a root canal performed by a hungover dentist. 2 more inspections, both routine, both involving starry-eyed buyers who thought love could overcome structural defects. I'd learned a long time ago not to get emotionally invested in other people's bad decisions, but today their optimism felt like salt in an open wound. By 5:30, I was parked across the street from Elena's office building, a gleaming glass monument to corporate ambition that looked completely out of place in our blue-collar town. Her car was still in the parking lot, a silver BMW that she'd bought last year after her company's first big contract. An investment in our image, she'd called it. I'd wanted to point out that my beat-up Ford had been getting me to job sites just fine for 15 years, but Elena had already moved on to more important topics. At 6:15, Miles Brennan's black Mercedes pulled up next to Elena's BMW. I watched him get out, all 6 feet of silver-haired confidence in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. He walked into the building like he owned it, which, for all I knew, maybe he did. 20 minutes later, they emerged together. Elena had changed clothes since morning, trading her conservative business attire for a red dress that I'd never seen before. It was the kind of dress that made statements, and the statement it was making was definitely not, "I'm having a boring client dinner with my business partner." They got into Miles's Mercedes, and I followed at a safe distance, feeling like a character in one of those detective novels I used to read before marriage and mortgages consumed all my free time. They drove across town to Chez Laurent, a French restaurant that had opened about 6 months ago and immediately became the place where our town's wannabe elite went to pretend they were sophisticated. I parked across the street and watched them through the restaurant's large front windows. They were seated at a corner table, intimate and secluded, the kind of spot you request when you want privacy for important conversations. Or romantic dinners with someone who isn't your spouse. Elena was animated, gesturing with her wine glass, laughing at whatever witty observations Miles was making. She looked happy, genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen in months, maybe years. When was the last time she'd looked at me like that? When was the last time she dressed up for dinner with me? I sat in my truck for 2 hours, watching my wife fall in love with another man while I tried to figure out how I'd become the villain in my own life story. Elena had painted me as the obstacle, the limited husband who didn't understand her vision. But from where I sat, it looked like the only thing I didn't understand was how completely I'd been played. They left the restaurant at 9:30, and instead of heading back to the office or toward Elena's car, Miles drove in the direction of the Grandview Hotel. The same hotel where Elena claimed she'd been staying during those out-of-town business trips that seemed to happen more and more frequently. I followed them to the hotel parking lot and watched Miles hand his keys to the valet like he was a regular customer. Elena took his arm as they walked through the lobby, her body language screaming intimacy and familiarity. These weren't two business partners grabbing a quick drink after dinner. These were two people who knew each other's bodies as well as they knew each other's minds. I drove home in a fog of rage and disbelief, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. The house felt like a mausoleum when I walked through the front door, all the furniture and photos and accumulated debris of 22 years of shared life, but none of the warmth that makes a house feel like a home. Elena's coffee mug was still in the sink, lipstick traces and all. I picked it up and hurled it against the kitchen wall, watching it explode into a dozen pieces that scattered across the linoleum floor like the fragments of my marriage. But as I swept up the broken ceramic, a plan started forming in my mind. Elena thought I was limited, predictable, too stupid to see what was happening right under my nose. Miles thought I was some blue-collar nobody who could be brushed aside like an inconvenient piece of furniture. They were both about to learn that underestimating Ben Carter was a mistake that would cost them everything they thought they'd built together. I'd spent my entire adult life learning how to spot structural weaknesses and document damage for insurance claims. Now it was time to put those skills to work on a much more personal project. Elena came home at 11:45 p.m., humming some tune I didn't recognize and smelling like expensive wine and another man's cologne. I was in the living room, pretending to watch the late news while actually planning the systematic destruction of her carefully constructed double life. "How was the client dinner?" I asked, without looking up from the television. "Productive," she said, kicking off her heels and heading toward the stairs. "Miles thinks we can close the Henderson deal by next week." Miles thinks. Not we think or the team thinks. Miles thinks. It was a small slip, but I'd learned that small slips usually revealed big truths, like water stains on a ceiling that pointed to major roof damage, or foundation cracks that indicated serious structural problems. "That's great, honey," I said, loading the word honey with just enough sarcasm to make it sting. But Elena was already upstairs, probably washing off the evidence of her romantic evening while I sat downstairs, contemplating the ruins of my marriage. The next few days fell into a routine that would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. Elena would leave early for strategy meetings and come home late from client dinners, while I went about my regular schedule of inspecting other people's houses and documenting their hidden problems. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was better at spotting structural damage in strangers' homes than I'd been at seeing the rot in my own marriage. But that changed on Thursday morning when I found the pregnancy test in the bathroom trash can. I'd gotten up early to fix a dripping faucet, another one of those small maintenance issues that Elena always claimed she didn't have time to deal with. The faucet was an easy fix, just a worn-out washer that needed replacing. But while I was digging under the sink for my tools, I knocked over the small trash can next to the toilet. The pregnancy test fell out along with the usual debris of tissues and cotton balls, landing on the bathroom floor like a small pink and white bomb. 2 lines. Positive. Elena was pregnant. I sat on the bathroom floor, holding that little plastic stick and trying to remember the last time Elena and I had been intimate. It had been months, at least 3, maybe 4. Our intimacy had been fading for the better part of 2 years, another casualty of Elena's growing career ambitions and my apparently limited appeal. But Elena was pregnant, and unless she'd experienced some kind of miraculous conception, Miles Brennan was about to become a daddy. I wrapped the test in toilet paper and put it back in the trash, then went about fixing the faucet with hands that shook slightly from rage and adrenaline. This changed everything. Elena wasn't just having an affair. She was building a whole new life with another man, and I was apparently the last person who was supposed to know about it. That evening, Elena came home from another late meeting, looking tired and slightly green around the gills. Morning sickness probably, though it was hitting her in the evening. She picked at her dinner, leftover Chinese takeout that I'd grabbed on the way home from a particularly depressing inspection, and kept checking her phone like she was waiting for important news. "You feeling okay?" I asked, playing the concerned husband while mentally preparing for the performance of a lifetime. "You look a little pale." "Just tired," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Work's been stressful lately." "Maybe you should see a doctor," I suggested helpfully. "Make sure everything's okay." Elena's head snapped up, and for a second I saw something like panic flash across her face. "I'm fine, Ben. Just need to get more sleep." But the next morning, she was in the bathroom for 20 minutes, and I could hear her retching through the thin door. When she finally emerged, she looked like she'd been hit by a truck carrying morning sickness and guilty consciences. "Food poisoning," she said weakly, brushing past me toward the bedroom. "Must have been something I ate at that new sushi place." Right. Food poisoning that lasted for weeks and came with missed periods. I'd been married to Elena for 22 years. I knew the difference between bad sushi and morning sickness. But I also knew that she was going to keep lying until she figured out how to spin this situation to her advantage. I gave her 3 days to come clean. 3 days of watching her struggle with nausea and exhaustion while she maintained the fiction that nothing had changed. 3 days of client dinners and strategy sessions while she figured out how to break the news that she was carrying another man's child. On Sunday evening, Elena finally made her move. She'd spent the day in bed, claiming she still wasn't feeling well, but by dinner time she'd managed to pull herself together enough for what was obviously going to be a carefully rehearsed conversation. "Ben," she said as we sat at the kitchen table with plates of pasta that neither of us was really eating, "I have something to tell you." I looked up from my spaghetti with an expression of mild curiosity, like a man who had no idea his world was about to explode. "What's up?" Elena took a deep breath and placed her hand on her stomach in a gesture that was probably supposed to look maternal and touching. "I'm pregnant." I let the fork fall from my hand and hit the plate with a small clink that sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Pregnant?" "I know it's a surprise," Elena said quickly. I was surprised too. "But I went to the doctor yesterday and it's confirmed. We're going to have a baby. We're going to have a baby." The audacity was breathtaking. Elena was sitting there, carrying another man's child, and she had the nerve to include me in the blessed event like I was some kind of unwitting participant in her reproductive adventures. "That's—" I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Elena squirm. "That's wonderful news, honey. I'm so happy, and I was happy in a way. Happy that Elena had finally given me the ammunition I needed to destroy her completely. Happy that her lies were getting so elaborate that she'd never be able to keep them straight. Happy that Miles Brennan was about to discover what happened when you messed with a man who had nothing left to lose." Elena's face relaxed into a smile that looked almost genuine. "I was worried about how you'd react. I know we hadn't been trying, but sometimes these things just happen." "Sometimes they do," I agreed, reaching across the table to take her hand. Her skin felt cold and slightly clammy, like she was running a fever or fighting off an infection. "Have you told anyone else yet?" Not yet, Elena said. I wanted to tell you first. Another lie, of course. She'd probably told Miles the second she peed on that stick. But I nodded like I believed her, like I was touched by her consideration for my feelings. We should celebrate, I said, squeezing her hand gently. This is big news. Elena smiled and squeezed back, and for a moment we looked like any other married couple sharing a moment of joy over their expanding family. But I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the wheels turning as she figured out how to manage this situation without destroying her carefully constructed new life. She had no idea that her old life was already over. She just didn't know it yet. That night, I lay in bed listening to Elena's breathing and planning my next move. The pregnancy changed the timeline, but it also simplified things in a way. Elena wasn't just cheating. She was preparing to abandon our marriage entirely. The baby was proof that she'd already made her choice. Now, I just had to make sure that choice cost her everything she'd worked for. I rolled over and smiled in the darkness. Elena thought she was so smart, so sophisticated, so much better than her limited husband. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated exactly how thorough I could be when I put my mind to it. By the time I was finished with her and Miles, they'd wish they'd never heard the name Ben Carter. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to my door. My daughter Jules, home from college for what she claimed was a surprise visit, but which I suspected had more to do with Elena's pregnancy announcement than any sudden desire to spend quality time with her old man. Jules had Elena's eyes and my stubborn streak, which made her either the perfect ally or the most dangerous enemy I could imagine. At 21, she was old enough to understand the complexities of adult relationships, but young enough to still believe in fairy tale endings and the basic goodness of people who'd spent 2 decades lying to her face. Dad! She threw her arms around me like I was a war hero returning from overseas instead of a middle-aged home inspector who'd just discovered his wife was carrying another man's child. Mom told me the good news. A baby. Can you believe it? Actually, I couldn't believe it, but probably not for the reasons Jules was thinking. I hugged her back and tried to figure out exactly how much Elena had told her and how much Jules had figured out on her own. It's definitely a surprise, I said carefully. Your mom and I weren't exactly planning on expanding the family at this stage of our lives. Jules pulled back and gave me a look that was pure Elena. Sharp, calculating, and just a little bit condescending. Sometimes the best things in life are unplanned, Dad. You should be excited. Should be. There was that word again, the same tone Elena used when she was telling me how I ought to feel about something. Like my emotions were just another home improvement project that needed the right tools and a little elbow grease. I am excited, I lied smoothly. It's just a lot to process, you know. Jules nodded like she understood, but I could see her filing away my reaction for later analysis. Elena had trained her well in the art of reading people and managing their responses. I wondered what other skills my wife had passed on to our daughter, and whether Jules was here as a genuine visitor or as Elena's advanced scout. So, how's school? I asked, changing the subject to safer ground. Last semester of your senior year, right? Actually, that's part of why I'm here, Jules said, and something in her tone made my internal alarm system start ringing like a smoke detector with a fading battery. I wanted to talk to you and Mom together about some changes to my plans. Changes to her plans. In my experience, when a 21-year-old wanted to talk about changes to their plans, it usually meant they'd either dropped out of school, gotten married, or decided to pursue a career in something that required parental financial support for the next decade. What kind of changes? I asked. Well, I've been thinking about taking a gap year after graduation. Maybe travel a little. Figure out what I really want to do with my life. Jules was using her most reasonable voice, the one she'd perfected during her teenage years when she wanted something that she knew I wouldn't approve of. I know you and Mom have been planning for me to go straight into graduate school, but I think I need some time to explore my options. Explore her options. With what money? Elena and I had been saving for Jules's education since she was born, but graduate school wasn't cheap, and a gap year of exploration could easily turn into a gap decade of parental subsidies. "That's an interesting idea," I said noncommittally. "Have you discussed this with your mother?" "A little bit," Jules said, which probably meant Elena had already given her blessing to whatever half-baked scheme Jules had cooked up. "She thinks it might be good for me to gain some real-world experience before committing to more school." Of course Elena thought that. Elena, who was currently gaining her own real-world experience with Miles Brennan while her husband played the role of clueless provider. I wondered if Jules knew about her mother's extracurricular activities, or if she was just another casualty in Elena's campaign of strategic deception. "We'll talk about it when your mother gets home," I said. "This kind of decision affects the whole family." Jules nodded, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. She'd expected me to be the pushover, the easy mark who'd cave to her arguments and put pressure on Elena to go along with the plan. Instead, I was acting like a responsible parent who actually cared about his daughter's future. The irony was that I did care about Jules's future, probably more than Elena did at this point. Elena was too busy building her new life with Miles to worry about the collateral damage to the family she was leaving behind. But Jules was still my daughter, regardless of what happened between Elena and me, and I wasn't going to let her become another casualty in this war. Elena came home that evening with takeout from an expensive Italian restaurant and a smile that looked like it had been painted on with a makeup brush. She kissed Jules on the cheek and gave me a perfunctory peck on the lips that felt about as romantic as a business handshake. "I'm so glad you're here, sweetheart," Elena said to Jules. "We have so much to catch up on." Over dinner, Jules laid out her gap year proposal with the kind of detailed presentation that would have made her business school professors proud. She had charts, timelines, and a budget that was only slightly more realistic than a lottery ticket. Elena listened with the kind of supportive attention that she used to give to my own dreams back when she still pretended to care about them. "I think it sounds like a wonderful opportunity for growth," Elena said when Jules finished her pitch. "You're only young once, and this could be exactly what you need to find your passion." Find her passion. Elena was big on passion these days, probably because she'd recently rediscovered her own with a silver-haired CEO who drove a Mercedes and knew how to order wine in French restaurants. "What do you think, Dad?" Jules asked, turning to me with hopeful eyes. I looked at my daughter, smart, ambitious, and completely unaware that her family was about to implode, and felt something twist in my chest like a wrench turning in the wrong direction. "I think," I said slowly, "that this is something we need to discuss as a family. There are financial considerations, practical issues, and long-term consequences that we all need to understand before making any decisions." Elena's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ben, don't you think Jules is old enough to make her own choices?" "I think Jules is old enough to understand that choices have consequences," I replied, "and that some consequences affect more than just the person making the choice." The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees, and Jules looked back and forth between her parents like she was watching a tennis match played with hand grenades instead of tennis balls. "Maybe we should table this discussion for tonight," Elena said with forced cheerfulness. "Jules just got home, and we should be celebrating the good news about the baby." The baby. Elena's trump card, the ultimate conversation stopper that was supposed to make everyone fall in line with her new vision of family harmony. But I wasn't ready to let her off the hook that easily. "You're right," I said, raising my glass of water in a mock toast. "Here's to new beginnings and unexpected surprises." Elena raised her own glass, but I could see the wariness in her eyes. She was starting to realize that I wasn't reacting to her pregnancy announcement the way she'd expected. I wasn't falling all over myself with gratitude and excitement. I wasn't treating her like some kind of miracle worker who'd blessed our marriage with renewed purpose. Instead, I was watching her like a home inspector who'd found termites in the foundation and was waiting to see how much damage they'd done before the whole structure came crashing down. Jules stayed for 3 days, and by the time she left, I had a pretty clear picture of where her loyalties lay. She was Team Elena all the way, convinced that her mother was a visionary entrepreneur who deserved support and understanding from her traditional husband. I was the obstacle, the stick in the mud who didn't appreciate Elena's ambition and couldn't adapt to the modern world of dual-career marriages. It stung, but it wasn't entirely surprising. Elena had been working on Jules for years, subtly undermining my authority and painting me as the boring, practical parent who didn't understand the bigger picture. Now that investment was paying off in the form of a daughter who saw me as the problem in her parents' marriage. But Jules wasn't the only family member I had to worry about. Elena's sister Tara had been calling more frequently lately, and her conversations with Elena always seemed to end with meaningful looks in my direction and whispered conferences that stopped the moment I walked into the room. Tara was Elena's closest confidant and biggest enabler, the kind of sister who would help you bury a body and then bring snacks to the funeral. If Elena was planning her exit strategy, Tara was probably helping her map out the route. I was going to need allies of my own if I wanted to survive what was coming, and I knew exactly where to start looking. Frank's boxing gym smelled like sweat, leather, and broken dreams, which made it the perfect place for me to work out my frustrations while planning the systematic destruction of my wife's double life. I'd been coming here twice a week for the past 5 years, ever since my doctor told me that my pressure was high enough to power a small city and I needed to find a healthier way to manage stress. Frank Kowalski was 73 years old, built like a fire hydrant, and had the kind of old-school wisdom that came from spending 60 years in boxing gyms, watching men destroy each other for sport and money. He'd been my trainer, therapist, and drinking buddy rolled into one gruff package that dispensed advice like a vending machine that only accepted exact change. "You're hitting that bag like it owes you money," Frank said, as I pounded out my frustrations on a heavy bag that had probably absorbed more anger than a marriage counselor. "What's eating you, Carter?" I stopped punching and wiped the sweat from my face with a towel that had seen better decades. "Women troubles, Frank. The kind that make a man question everything he thought he knew about his life." Frank nodded knowingly. He'd been married 4 times and divorced 3 times, which made him either an expert on women or a glutton for punishment. Possibly both. "Let me guess," Frank said, settling onto a folding chair that creaked under his weight. "Your wife's been working late, dressing better, and treating you like your furniture that she's thinking about replacing." "Something like that," I said, not ready to share the full extent of Elena's betrayal with anyone, even Frank. "How'd you know?" "Because I've been there, son. 3 times, as a matter of fact." Frank pulled out a cigarette and lit it, despite the fact that smoking had been banned in public buildings for about 20 years. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" That was the question, wasn't it? What was I going to do about it? For 22 years, I'd been the steady, reliable husband who fixed things when they broke and kept his mouth shut when they didn't. I'd been Elena's foundation, her safety net, her fallback plan when her dreams got too big for reality to support. But foundations could crack under enough pressure, and safety nets could be cut if you knew where to find the right threads. "I'm thinking about making some changes of my own," I said carefully. "Maybe it's time I stopped being so predictable." Frank grinned, showing teeth that looked like they'd been arranged by someone with a grudge against orthodontists. "Now you're talking. You want some free advice from an old fool who's made every mistake in the book?" "I'm listening." "Don't get mad," Frank said, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "Get even. But be smart about it. Women like your wife, they think they're playing chess while you're playing checkers. Show them that you've been playing chess all along, and you're just better at it than they are. Chess, not checkers. I like that analogy. Elena thought she was the master strategist, moving pieces around the board while I sat in the corner playing with my little tools. But she'd forgotten that I'd been inspecting other people's houses for 20 years, which meant I'd gotten very good at finding hidden problems and documenting them for insurance purposes. Any specific advice? I asked. Frank stubbed out his cigarette on the concrete floor and looked at me with eyes that had seen enough fights to know the difference between winners and losers. Yeah, he said, hit them where it hurts most. For women like your wife, that's usually their reputation and their bank account. Make them choose between their pride and their pocketbook, and watch them tear themselves apart trying to save both. Their reputation and their bank account. Elena had worked for 15 years to build her professional image as a successful entrepreneur and sophisticated businesswoman. Miles had probably worked even longer to establish himself as a respected CEO and community leader. They both had a lot to lose if their affair became public knowledge, and I had all the evidence I needed to make sure it did. I spent another hour at the gym, working through combinations on the heavy bag, while my mind worked through combinations of a different sort. By the time I left, I had the beginnings of a plan that would have made Frank proud, and Elena very, very sorry. But first, I had some reconnaissance work to do. Elena's client dinner that night was at the Grandview Hotel, the same place where she and Miles had been conducting their romantic business meetings. I knew this because I'd started checking her credit card statements online, another advantage of being married to someone who thought you were too technologically challenged to be a threat. I arrived at the hotel at 7:30 and positioned myself in the lobby bar with a clear view of the restaurant entrance. Elena and Miles arrived 15 minutes later, looking like a couple celebrating their anniversary, instead of two business partners discussing quarterly projections. They were seated at the same corner table they'd occupied during their previous meeting, and from my vantage point I could see Elena laughing at Miles's jokes and touching his hand across the table like a woman who'd forgotten she had a wedding ring on her finger. But tonight was different. Tonight I wasn't just watching, I was recording. The smartphone that Elena had bought me for Christmas, claiming I needed to join the 21st century, was now documenting her journey into adultery with high-definition clarity. I got pictures of them holding hands across the table. Video of Miles feeding Elena a bite of dessert with intimate familiarity. Audio of their conversation when they moved to the bar after dinner, thanks to a recording app that Jules had installed on my phone during one of her visits home. I can't wait much longer, Elena was saying, her voice slightly slurred from wine and infatuation. Living with Ben is like being married to a piece of furniture. He's there, he's functional, but there's no passion, no excitement. Soon, Miles replied, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. Once the Henderson deal closes, we'll have enough capital to make our move. You can file for divorce, we can announce our partnership, and you'll be free to start the life you deserve. The life she deserved. I wondered if that life included explaining to our daughter why Mommy had decided that Daddy was obsolete, or if Elena had already figured out a way to make me the villain in that story too. What about Ben? Elena asked. He's not going to just disappear quietly. He'll want his share of everything. Miles laughed, a sound like breaking glass wrapped in silk. Let him have the house and whatever's left in your joint accounts. Small price to pay for your freedom. Besides, what's he going to do? He's a home inspector, not a lawyer. He probably doesn't even know what his rights are. What's he going to do? That was a very good question, and one that Miles was about to get a very detailed answer to. They left the hotel at 10:15, and I followed them to Miles's apartment complex, a luxury high-rise that had been built 5 years ago to attract young professionals who wanted to live like they were in a big city while still enjoying small-town prices. Elena's BMW was already in the parking garage, which meant she'd been planning to spend the night there all along. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes, watching the lights come on in Miles's 10th-floor apartment and trying to decide whether I felt more angry or relieved. Angry because my wife was upstairs making love to another man while I sat in a parking garage like some kind of deranged stalker. Relieved because I finally had all the evidence I needed to destroy both of them completely. Elena came home at 6:30 the next morning, sneaking through the front door like a teenager coming home after curfew. She found me in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the morning paper like a man who had no idea his wife had spent the night committing adultery in a luxury apartment across town. "You're up early," she said, avoiding my eyes as she headed for the coffee maker. "Couldn't sleep," I said truthfully. "Too much on my mind." Elena poured herself a cup of coffee with hands that shook slightly. Whether from guilt or exhaustion, I couldn't tell. She looked older in the morning light, worn down by the effort of maintaining her double life and the physical demands of pregnancy. "Ben," she said suddenly, turning to face me with an expression that might have been sincerity if I hadn't known better. "I want you to know that I appreciate everything you've done for me over the years. Building a life together, supporting my dreams, being patient while I figured out my career. You're a good man. A good man." Past tense. Elena was already writing my eulogy, preparing to bury our marriage with kind words and fond memories, while she moved on to her exciting new life with Miles. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a lot." Elena smiled, the first genuine smile she'd given me in months, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. She had no idea what was coming. She thought she was managing the situation, controlling the narrative, protecting everyone's feelings while she engineered her graceful exit from our marriage. She was about to learn that some exits aren't graceful and some feelings don't need protecting. I finished my coffee, kissed Elena goodbye like a loving husband, and headed off to work with a phone full of evidence and a heart full of righteous fury. Elena wanted a new life. I was about to give her one. She just wasn't going to like it very much.